class. As I mentioned previously, the next focus area for this week is going to be on the rise of those early civilizations. And as stated in the previous lesson, long before Greece and Rome, there was Mesopotamia and Egypt. So today we're going to focus on the rise of Mesopotamia and trying to determine what factors it contributed to our concept of Western civilization. So the societies of early Western civilization are composed of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey, as you can see on this map here before you, which is also in your textbook. The first cities actually developed among the Sumerians in Mesopotamia, that green spot there over on the right-hand side of the map, by around 4000 to 3000 BCE. The civilization in Egypt along the Nile River, there in northern Africa on the left-hand side of the map in the pink area, developed around 3050 BCE. And Anatolia, up top in modern-day Turkey, and as you can see, Greece is just off to the left, so that blue area with the Hittites, and then off to the left, the early Greek cultures, developed around 2000 to 1900 BCE. All of these peoples learned from and built on, however, the civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt. And it really is the cities in Mesopotamia that were the first cities to develop in our sense of Mesopotamia. Again, cultural interaction is going to be important to understanding this concept, either provoked by international trade, but also of war, that prompted much of the spread of civilization and that evolution as well. So looking here, we have the map of actual Mesopotamia itself, what's known as the Fertile Crescent. As you can see, it's pretty much what we would consider in the modern period as the Middle East. So where did Western civilization begin? How do we view Western civilization as beginning in the Middle East? If you take a look at the map, one thing I want you to consider, and consider this again when you post in the discussion forum, is how might geography have lent itself to the creation of these early civilizations? What I mean by that is, if you look at this map and look in that green colored area of the Fertile Crescent, you will notice two blue lines going through the middle. Rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. And it is among these rivers and in between that Fertile Crescent developed. Mesopotamians were the first peoples to learn to manipulate their environment by being able to channel the water, creating canals from those rivers to water fields in what is pretty much a very dry area of the world. One thing I also want to point out on this map as well, if you notice down near the Persian Gulf in the lower right-hand corner, there's a dotted line that says a presumed ancient coastline. Of course, there's been global climatic weather changes and patterns throughout history that have changed to a certain extent water levels across the globe, again, throughout time. And so it is believed by many historians that the Persian Gulf used to be a lot larger, and so that the actual coastline would have gone up to these early cities. You think about it, water is fundamental not only to watering fields or helping with agriculture, but also with communication and trade and commerce. So that ends up becoming kind of important when you think about the cities of Ur and Uruk being some of the very first cities For example, last week when we talked about our primary source, Lagash and right? There's the city that we talked about, who they were the antagonists in that story. So where did these cities emerge? They emerged in Sumer. This is actually the ziggurat, which is the central temple inside the city of obviously a drawing and a recreation. The need to irrigate the fertile but dry plains around the Euphrates and Tigris produced a centralized political authority and organized cities led by kings. Again, those who would have been powerful enough, either by conquering and having smart, intelligent followers, to be able to organize these large building projects, would have been those in control. If you think about trying to get everybody to build these canals, to organize labor, that's only possible when you have an agricultural surplus that allows those social inequalities in the first place. By 3000 BCE, the Sumerians had actually established 12 independent city-states, each of which had expanded to approximately 20,000 residents or more by the year 2500 BCE. Totally small in our modern concepts, but again, thinking about the fact that all the labor is done manually, by hand, with wooden tools. Metal comes into play just a little bit later. Same with the wheel. That's a lot of people to keep organized and maintained. So 20,000 definitely, and being able to keep that 20,000 fed and to keep order and justice takes a strong central authority. In fact, most cities would have been laid out fairly similarly, but again, because of this scarceness of the resources and especially the volatile nature of the two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, these city-states warred with each other constantly fighting for access and control of those resources. So Mesopotamian societies are going to grow up with large defensive walls, same layout with a large ziggurat, their religious temple, right there in the middle, symbolizing their administration and their relationship to their gods, who would usually be on the sides of the warriors. Again, thinking about the inscription we read from last week, you can see how gods played in this idea of warfare and who would be on the side of the winners, as well as control over those access to water and fields. So Mesopotamia grew up to be a very warlike, defensive society with kings on top. Kings usually, while they may have been hereditary and come from their role passed down from father to son, most kings would rise to power again because of their prowess, their greatness with the sword in this warlike society. So they were responsible for ensuring justice, as we'll see in the Law Code of Hammurabi, developing laws, keeping order, but also, as we've noticed again in that inscription and in the Law Code of Hammurabi, in waging war, in being able to expand territory and access to resources, to extract tribute or taxes from the people in order to survive and to live, obviously, then in a certain amount of wealth and luxury. And in this society, having a power of life and death over their servants. As I mentioned in the previous lesson, slaves were always at the bottom of the social hierarchy. Again, not necessarily slavery based on race or ethnicity, and slaves could be simply dedicated to the temples, individuals or temple officials, or they could be owned by individuals. Usually individuals would only own maybe 1 to 2 slaves to help out with some of the domestic chores around the house, meals, going to the market, helping in the fields. Slavery, therefore, was usually determined on being captured in warfare, prisoners of war, being sold into slavery to pay off your debt, but it was also a hereditary position. Along with the social inequalities, and especially to keep track of those taxes, writing was developed around 3500 BCE. Again, usually to track the more complex economic transactions, especially tribute and taxes. Writing evolved from pictographs that symbolized specific objects to mixed pictographs and phonetic symbols, and eventually to the type of alphabet that represents sounds that we're used to in our modern languages. You'll be able to see examples of some of this early form of writing developed by the Sumerians called cuneiform. There's an example in the textbook. Cuneiform, was made up of wedge marks that were pressed into clay tablets. Writing, again, beginning as a record of economic transactions, soon began to include stories or mythologies, recording poetry, different literature and beliefs. And again, if you think about the fact that paper is not yet invented and that these early stories, these early laws would have been inscribed in clay or chiseled into the rock itself, quite permanent, this idea of writing. Can't necessarily erase it with an eraser or backspace. And can you imagine the weight that these documents, if you call them that, these clay cylinders, how much that would have weighed, but also the fragility, how easy it is to a certain extent to break clay. What kind of value then did people have on writing, because it had almost this more permanent nature to it? Here we have a map then, again, of the cities. You can see Sumerian civilization there right in the green. Again, closer to the Persian Gulf, closer to access to that coastline, commerce and exchange, but still right in the middle of the two rivers and access to easy irrigation. Some of the early kings would have been listed here. Sargon, king of the Akkadians, that began to build the first empire in 2350 as they conquered neighboring territory and cities in search of metals. The Bronze Age, and the discovery of metal and the use of it, especially in warfare, being prominent and important in the spread of civilization at this time. So Sumerian culture was conquered and spread. The spread of the Mesopotamian Sumerian language, art, and literature throughout the Near East by these Akkadians. However, civil war, as well as an attack from outside from some hill people known as the Gutians, overthrew the Akkadian Empire in 2200. So the empire itself only lasted about 150 years. Short-lived, disruptive, but important in that spread of that early Sumerian culture. The image here is a depiction of the Sumerian king Sargon. Leaders of Ur dynasty, again that city close to the Persian Gulf, developed a centralized economy and system of laws underneath their kings who claimed to be divine. And you'll see this again, these ideas shaped in the law codes of Hammurabi. Civil war again weakened that empire, and external marauders caused its collapse after only about a century of rule. Again, this is going to be kind of a common theme in the development of Mesopotamian societies: conflict and conquest from without. Which leads us to the Assyrians. Western civilization advanced even more during this period of long-term economic stability. The Assyrians had inhabited an independent kingdom in northern Mesopotamia. They pioneered long-distance trade by private entrepreneurs, again, trying to stabilize some of the effects of their own lack of access to resources. They were able to establish connections to Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, and to bring back products such as wood, copper, and gold, and distribute them throughout Mesopotamia, which provided high profits for investors. Obviously, though, again, thinking about the technology and available resources, took a lot to bring these items from Turkey into Assyria. Donkey caravans had to go long distances. But with these imports of goods, the demand for these luxury items rose. And so legislatures or regulators had to intervene to help settle complaints as well as support the trade. Because once someone has a taste for something from a long distance, usually they don't want to give that up. Hammurabi, as we know, is one of the great kings of Babylon. Falling in line of this Mesopotamian society as a king who, again, saw his sacred duty to maintain order. We all know him through his law codes. And to a certain extent, we believe that they are the first surviving written codes of law. However, they were probably not the first actual codes of law, but just those that we have surviving. You can see built in them this development throughout Mesopotamian society. In the law codes, you can see that he sought to maintain truth and equity, and gave a new attention to supporting the less powerful members of society. There are consequences for killing a slave, even if it just be some type of fine. The code includes, in fact, severe penalties for property crimes, and did offer some limited legal rights to women. Also, you'll notice a lot of the law codes are based on that idea of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but are determined on your social status. So it's a very interesting law code and really gives us a clear insight into how life was organized in these early Mesopotamian societies and what types of problems were evident in these societies, and how these kings sought or thought of social justice. Here you can see most Mesopotamian life took place in the city. You can see in this image here the high defensive walls to protect those within. Inside these cities would have included taverns, wine shops, as well as some public parks. Public health obviously would be an issue. There are no modern plumbing, which can create some problems and spread of disease. Intellectual life was stimulated, though, by the close proximity of so many, and tremendous advances in mathematics and astronomy would take place during the period. So looking back over what we just covered on this early Mesopotamian society and trying to figure out what types of social values and what we can learn from these, what life was like in these early civilizations. There was a high value placed on family and life. Again, this is really evident when you read the law codes of Hammurabi, the consequences for causing a miscarriage, for instance, or the role of the legitimacy of children. There's one reason why there's so many laws that deal with infidelity or adultery. It was very important to understand who the father of certain children were and the role that that played within family life. You have to imagine that life expectancy during these early civilizations was around the age of 30. So you all, if you're just out of high school, would be middle-aged. Those of us who are actually in our middle-aged in modern sense would probably be dead. So there's a high value placed on life, access to those resources. Gender roles, again, are something to take away from this. Early Mesopotamian society was a patriarchal society, meaning that men usually had an upper hand in power and authority, and women were usually subordinate. However, there were some rights that were given to women, and women could leave men or divorce them in certain circumstances. You can also tell in the law codes that men usually worked outside of the home, either as warriors, farmers, merchants. So why study early Mesopotamia in this? Again, these ideas of settling farming communities into the rise of city-states, populations, governments that include law codes that define social hierarchy, and most important, the exchange and spread of culture and ideas. As we'll see next week when we hit Greece, all of these ideas will eventually spread all the way from the Near East into what we consider Europe and the West.